The first sociological theory of crime and deviance that we will focus on is the symbolic interactionist perspective. Now, uh, under the symbolic interactionist perspective, there are three versions of symbolic interactionism here, three different sort of approaches to it. Um, One of them is going to be called differential association theory. We are also going to learn a little bit about something called control theory. And then we are also going to talk about labeling theory, which I think I mentioned it to you when we were looking at Goffman and we were talking about stigma. I think I mentioned labeling theory in that context. So in this part, we are going to focus on differential association and control theory, and I'm going to leave labeling theory for its own little treatment because it's probably the most involved one that we're going to be talking about. I know you're probably wondering what those pink lines are there, but you'll find out, okay? So differential association theory comes to us from a man named Edwin Sutherland. Edwin Sutherland uh, was born in 1883, died in 1950, uh, quite renowned in the field of not just in sociology, but in the field of criminology. Um, Approaches the question of crime and deviance from the point of view of symbolic interactionism, uh, developing this thing he calls differential association theory. And I think another thing we should say about Edwin Sutherland, we'll be talking more about it a little bit later on, but Edwin Sutherland was one of the very first people to study systematically white collar crime and gives us that term. He was the one that coined that term, white collar crime. So here we go, all right? Differential association theory, first of all, we're going to say it's a learning theory, social learning theory, and it focuses on the socialization process. Okay, so it focuses on the socialization process. Uh, Behavior is learned through socialization. Now, people learn to deviate from, or they learn to conform to society's norms from different, highlight, different groups that they highlight, associate with, right? People learn to deviate from or conform to society's norms from different groups that they associate with. Hence the name differential association. Deviance is learned. Now, I think one of the things that I would sort of say about this is, if any of you out there were ever warned by your parents that maybe you're hanging around with the wrong people, maybe if you ever had that talk where they're saying, well, you're hanging around with the wrong group, you're hanging around with the wrong crowd, and they're having a bad influence on you. Your parents didn't know it, but they were sort of talking the way that differential association theory talks. So, deviance is learned. Well, where's it learned from? From where do we learn it? Well, in our everyday lives, we associate with different kinds of groups, right? All different kinds of groups. So these might include our family, right? Our neighborhood, the YMCA, the local street gang, whoever it might be. We associate with all these different groups. We move between them. And from each of those groups, we learn either conformity to society's norms or we learn deviance, right? So, from the YMCA, you're going to learn one thing, probably conformity, but from the local criminal subculture, right, from the local street gang, you maybe are going to learn deviance, right, or criminality, right? And so as we move between these different groups, we don't really receive consistent messages. One group is going to present us with a message of conformity. Other groups are going to present us with a message of deviance. So these differential associations that Sutherland is talking about will, first of all, vary in frequency, right? They're going to vary in duration. They're going to vary in priority. Which ones do we prioritize? Do we place more emphasis, for example, on what our family tells us to do, or do we put more emphasis on or prioritize what the local street gang tells us to do? So priority, and they're also going to vary by intensity, how strong these messages are. So what all those things are, what all those words are, frequency, duration, priority, and intensity, what they all have to do with is exposure, right? Exposure to the message of conformity, or exposure to the message of deviance or criminality. And we don't always receive consistent messages. Like I said, we move from one group to the next, we're getting mixed messages, right? So the way that Sutherland talked about it was very simple, very simply like this. He said, if we are exposed to what he called an excess of deviant definitions, if that message of deviance is much stronger, if we're exposed to an excess of deviant definitions, we become deviant. If we are exposed to an excess of conforming definitions, we conform. Can we get that? Right? So that's basically differential association, right? So if we accumulate, the way he would put it, we accumulate an excess of deviant definitions, we become deviant. If we accumulate an excess of conforming definitions, we conform. If our exposure to the deviant definitions is stronger than our exposure to the conforming definitions, then we become deviant or criminal, okay? So that's the way he understood it. Now, there is a way, right, that differential association theory gets applied in real life, right? And it has to do with the recidivism rate. There is a place in your book where Henslin talks about the recidivism rate. Some of you, I think, are criminal justice majors. You may already know what the recidivism rate is. So the recidivism rate describes the rate of re-imprisonment, right? So people get arrested, they get convicted, they go to prison, and then they come out of prison, they serve their time, they come out of prison, and then they go commit another crime, and they get rearrested and sent back to prison again. So that's that rate of re-imprisonment is what we call the recidivism rate. Now, differential association theory has been used to try to explain the recidivism rate. And basically like this, right? If we can imagine, let me give you a little hypothetical situation here. If we can imagine a kid, an 18-year-old kid who does something stupid, makes a stupid mistake. Let's say, steals a car, right, or robs a liquor store, or, gets caught possessing drugs or dealing drugs, something like that. They make a stupid mistake, and at this point, they aren't perhaps hardened criminals, right? And so they get sent to prison for however long their sentence is. Let's say they get sentenced to 5 years in prison for something. Now they're in prison. who are they now exposed to, right? Who are they now exposed to? Well, now they are exposed to more uh, people, right, who are actually hardened criminals. And there's a place where sociologists even, or criminologists even, people that study the criminal justice program have talked about, the prison as a kind of school of crime. So they, in the time that kid spends in prison, he is now sort of receiving 24/7, right? Criminal definitions of reality. And so he's accumulating those excess of criminal definitions, of deviant definitions, and becoming, now starting to think and identify maybe even as a criminal. So I remember seeing a documentary about MS-13. How many of you have heard of MS-13? But if you haven't, you can look them up. MS-13 is a international criminal organization, international gang organization. And I remember in this documentary, they're talking to members of MS-13 who describe prison as they describe going to prison the same way that you would describe going to college. It's where they went to actually learn their craft. So anyway, that is the way differential association theory is used, perhaps, to explain the recidivism rate. All right, so where do we go next? Well, the last theory we're going to do in this little part before we move on to labeling theory is we're going to talk about control theory, something called control theory, which is another social learning theory. Comes to us from this guy. His name was Walter Reckless. He lived from 1899 to 1988. And what he argues is that, in our everyday lives, we have these pushes and pulls toward deviance or toward delinquency, and that these pushes or pulls are essentially everywhere. These pushes and pulls might include things like the conditions of poverty or exposure to delinquent or criminal subcultures. And so these pressures to deviate are counteracted, right? The pressures to deviate are counteracted or contained by the internalization of controls. He called them, there were inner and there were outer controls. So we're always pulled toward criminality or always pulled toward delinquency or deviance, but that pull toward deviance or delinquency is counteracted or counterbalanced or restrained by the extent to which we internalize the effect of these different controls. So these controls, for example, might include the influence of our families, the influence of our friends, or even the influence of the police. All of these various agents of socialization, right, that influence us to conform to societal norms. And, they are outer controls, they're external controls, they're outside of us, right? Family, friends, police, they are all outside of us. Now, we also internalize inner controls. And so inner controls are internalized values. So these may be things like religious principles, for example, or any other internalization of any notion of right and wrong, for example. Now, when we have strong ties, or we have strong bonds with society, these inner controls become more effective, right? When we're integrated more fully into those outer controls, the inner controls become more effective. And that, in essence, is Walter Reckless's control theory, internalization of internal and external controls. And so, like I said, the next thing we're going to move on to in part 6 is going to be labeling theory.